So this forum is entitled, Which Way in Korea? Threats and War, or Olympic Truce and Diplomacy. I'd like to thank Fort Greenpeace, Peace Action New York State, and the Historians for Peace and Democracy for their co-sponsorship and for helping us to get the word out about this event. We're very glad to have with us two speakers to help us tackle the question of whether war on the Korean Peninsula is an imminent possibility in view of President Trump's threats and militaristic posture. In particular, we hope that with a deeper understanding, we will be better equipped to take action to prevent what could be a catastrophic war. Juyeon J.C. is a Korean-born grassroots organizer with Nodutdol for Korean Community Development. She's a graduate of Brooklyn Law School and a board member of both Nodutdol and the Korea Policy Institute. And she will present a brief history specifically for peace activists leading up to the current crisis. William Hartung, or Bill as we know him, is director of the Arms and Security Project at the Center for International Policy. And he will delve into the background of U.S. nuclear policy as it relates to North Korea.
I'm going to talk a little bit about the prospects for war and prospects for peace. And I don't pretend to have some unique answer that you haven't heard before, but I think it's good to walk through it anyway. I think even the non-insane officers in the U.S. military understand that a war in Korea would be a disaster. There is no military solution to the North Korean nuclear issue. Even a conventional war would cause tens or hundreds of thousands of deaths because Seoul is close to the North Korean border. They have many conventional missiles. Even if North Korea would be defeated, it would be at a huge price in South Korean lives of the United States troops, and so forth. And this notion that somehow they could have a precision strike and eliminate only the nuclear facilities. Of course, as peace activists, you've heard that term many, many times before, being in Vietnam, being in Iraq, and we understand that there are no precision strikes, that there's always collateral damage, which means civilians being killed. And furthermore, U.S. intelligence doesn't actually know where these things are. So even if they wanted to eliminate them with airstrikes, they wouldn't be able to do it. So the Pentagon had a study that was leaked that said basically the only way to get rid of the North Korean nuclear weapons would be a ground invasion, which many of them are not willing to undertake. So we have some problematic figures like H.R. McMaster, who thinks that they can launch what he calls a bloody nose strike, which basically means, well, we'll just show him what we've got. We'll attack him, he'll back off, and all will be well for the United States and Korea. And of course, that's not what's going to happen. It would be a very unpredictable situation. As soon as the strike occurs, we don't know how they're going to retaliate. We don't know how it's going to escalate. And the idea that somebody who's purportedly a professional military officer would even think of such a thing is a little bit shocking. And there's this notion that Kim Jong-un is crazy, you can't deal with him, what's with this person, and so forth. There's some similarly questionable thinking on the U.S. side of the equation, which is never treated as such in our press, of course. The bottom line is we have to do everything we can to make sure this doesn't happen. And it means speaking out in every way possible, getting our members of Congress to make noise, and doing what we can in all the ways we can think of to make people understand that this is not a war that we can allow to begin. The other thing to think about is that I think a lot of Americans think that the choice is either to get rid of Kim Jong-un and his nukes, or the United States will be attacked. That essentially our lives are at risk. And if you saw the false alarm in Hawaii and how people reacted to that, clearly a lot of people feel that way. But William Perry, who was Secretary of Defense under Clinton, who did some of the negotiations that actually paused the North Korean nuclear program for about a decade, has basically said there's no way in hell that Kim Jong-un would attack the United States because he has 15 or 20 nuclear weapons. He's not even sure that they can reach here reliably. The United States has 4,000, any of which could reach North Korea. And he may be a dictator, but he's not suicidal. There's no way of being a dictator if you're going to die, because it's not nearly as fun as being a dictator. So the point that Perry made is the only way there's likely to be a conventional nuclear war in the Korean Peninsula is through miscalculation. And we're at very high risk of that because Kim Jong-un and Trump are trading insults. So when Trump says it's going to be fire and fury, the likes of which you've never seen before, my first reaction is, like he spoke a complete sentence. But unfortunately, it's not a sentence we want to hear. Of course, he had the tweet about my button is larger than your button. Actually, it's not controlled by a button, but maybe if he thinks it is, we're safer. It's actually, secret codes in the suitcase. But anyway, he was being metaphorical. My button's bigger than your button, and my button works. So if you're sitting on the other side of that, how do you know when this guy is just mouthing off? And how do you know when he's about to attack you? So a lot of people say, well, with Trump, don't listen to what he says. That's the sideshow. Just watch what he does. But when he's talking about nuclear weapons, that doesn't apply because those threats can be taken as real. And if Kim Jong-un thinks that he's about to be attacked, that's probably the only circumstance under which he would try to attack Korea or Japan or the United States. So the rhetoric matters in this case. There's sort of this is more recent history than we've heard because I don't know all the history that you were presenting. But certainly in the post-Cold War period, North Korea is often used as an example of a threat that is used to justify lots of nuclear weapons on the part of the United States, lots of military spending. Basically, we wouldn't be spending, close to $1 trillion a year on all different manner of Homeland Security and the Pentagon and all the other, security-related functions of the United States government if people weren't afraid of something, And at the end of the Cold War, Colin Powell said, once the Soviet Union dissolved, he said, well, I'm kind of running out of enemies here, I got Cuba, I got North Korea, I got nothing, And so what they did was they rejiggered their strategy for what they called two major regional conflicts. One was with Iraq, and one was with North Korea. And then, of course, Bush gave his Axis of Evil speech, where he tried to make it sound like Iran, Iraq, North Korea were some sort of unified force whose only purpose was to attack and undermine the United States of America. And Trump's UN speech that he gave last fall had similar rhetoric and a similar feel to it, sort of another Axis of Evil speech, essentially. And so, to some degree, the U.S. military establishment, the military complex, needs North Korea to be an enemy because it's that climate of fear that allows them to pick our pockets for all those billions and billions of dollars. And in fact, a lot of the stock analysts have been saying this. They said, well, as long as this Korea conflict continues, it's good times for Lockheed Martin and Boeing, Northrop Grumman and General Dynamics and all the weapons contractors. One guy told the Washington Post, he said, well, airstrikes are in and diplomacy's out. So, it's happy days are here again if you're a military contractor. So you have sort of those prophets of fear. I'm being brief because I just am. But the question is, what's the way forward? And I think the bias in our news is that somehow North Korea is unreliable, diplomacy is impossible, force is almost inevitable. And you'll see this in small ways, like the Olympic truce and the unification of the Olympic teams and the discussions between North and South. The New York Times described it as it was this wily Kim Jong-un trying to drive a wedge between the United States and South Korea. Well, if the United States' position is to start a war in the Korean Peninsula, I'm all for the wedge. I mean, the point was that the Korean leadership was taking it upon itself to chart a different course, a diplomatic course, which is much more promising and much less dangerous. And so if that means that they're out in front of what Donald Trump would like to do, I'm behind that 100%. And so the question becomes, how do we gauge where we are? You know, given Trump's kind of bluster, his rhetoric, his kind of inconsistency. And you'll see this, you know, some of his people, like Secretary of State Tillerson or Secretary of Defense Mattis, will make points about, well, you know, of course, we wouldn't use force first, we'll explore all diplomatic options. And then Trump will tweet, you know, oh, Rex, forget about that. You know, little rocket man is just, you know, he's not going to negotiate with us. And so, you know, so you never quite know when Trump is going to upset any ability to make a real diplomatic connection. But I think it is possible to be done. Certainly under Clinton, North Korea was willing to negotiate, but there had to be certain conditions. First of all, you know, let's start with an open mind. It's you know, the Trump position has been, and many times, get rid of your nuclear weapons and then we'll talk. But their position is also, we're going to wipe you off the face of the earth, which is not a reason to get rid of your nuclear weapons. So it's got to be from a position of no preconditions, no threat of regime change, and then gradual steps. You know, we'll lift sanctions in exchange for, say, a freeze in the nuclear program. We'll pull back on the military exercises, which are quite menacing. And not only do they use nuclear-capable bombers, but one of the things they practice is what they call a decapitation strike, in order towards murdering Kim Jong-un. So you can understand why he's upset about this. And we were talking before about when he threatened to send a missile near Guam, which is a major U.S. base. It seemed kind of you know, extreme, but it's no more extreme than the U.S. flying nuclear bombers close to North Korean soil, or having exercises where they're practicing to assassinate the leader of that country. You could imagine if any country did that anywhere near the borders of the United States, how our government would react. So this notion that, you know, on one side you've got this kind of crazy dictator, and on the other side you've got this rational country, unfortunately doesn't apply in the current situation. And that's why it's harder to predict how it's going to play out. But I do believe, because many in the professional military understand there's no military solution, because there's been a success of diplomacy before, you know, under the Clinton approach, which William Perry, I mentioned before, was in the middle of, and Jimmy Carter actually kicked off at a moment when it seemed like war was imminent. You know, that lasted for 10 years. And the only reason it stopped was actually when Bush came in. They had been on the verge of a deal to get rid of North Korea's nuclear bombs and nuclear missile production capability. And Clinton ran out of time. Colin Powell, you know, carried over into the Bush administration, and he said, you know, this is a good process, we should continue it. And virtually overnight, all the neocons who brought us the Iraq War, among many other shameful things they've done, basically cut Colin Powell off the knee, said we can't talk to these people. John Bolton was in the middle of this effort. And Powell had to go back and say, oh, yeah, I guess we're not talking, you know. And it's all the times when they haven't talked, when the North Korean nuclear program has mushroomed. All the times that there have been talks, when there's been negotiations, when there's been an honest back and forth, the program has been limited and curbed. And now we're in a much different situation, of course, because they have 15 or 20 nuclear weapons, they have missiles that are improving. So if anything, if I were leading a U.S. initiative, I would be a little more humble about it. I wouldn't sort of lead with all this bluster that Trump seems to be so fond of. You know, there is some action in Congress, not as much as we need, but there's a couple bills. I know a couple were mentioned on the board. And there's a related bill by Chris Murphy of Connecticut that basically says Congress will not appropriate funds for a first strike on North Korea. It's got 8 or 10 co-sponsors, including Kirsten Gillibrand, not Charles Schumer, who always has to be, but kicking and dragging into these kinds of things. But it would be a big thing if we were to bring him over, because he would bring others with him. And then there's a similar measure in the House. Representative Ro Khanna of California has been the leader on many issues, including against the U.S. war in Yemen and other peace issues. And he has 67 co-sponsors, including many New York reps. Not all of them, but people like Yvette Clarke and Joe Nadler, and there's at least half a dozen New York reps on that bill. But I mean, every representative in the New York area, New York State should be on that bill, and it shouldn't just be, Congress has a zillion bills, and you can sign on to something, and that's the end of it. Or you can sign on to it, you can fight for it, you can talk about it, you can speak out every time there's a misleading press account, when the president makes an inflammatory statement. The last thing we want is the impression that people are going to sit still for this. And so I think if we're going to bother to elect these people, we should force them to take place in leadership role in this particular issue, because there's more at stake than in many of the other conflicts that we've fought against in our lifetimes.
I want you to talk about the freeze to freeze a little bit.
Oh, sure. So an idea that's been floated as a way to get negotiations going is freeze U.S. military exercises, North Korea freeze its program, don't do any tests during that period. And the Pentagon's been they've dug their heels in about that. They say these exercises are essential to defense cooperation with South Korea and so forth. And so there's actually been some flexibility on the North Korean side, in the sense that they've said, well, if you get rid of the most objectionable aspects of the exercises, like flying nuclear bombers, like practicing assassinating our leader, not really very onerous demands, that might be sufficient to get conversation going. So it's not even, they're not even asking to stop the exercises in whole, they're just saying rein in the most aggressive, in-your-face aspects of the exercises. So it kind of flips that question on its head about who's being reasonable and who's being unreasonable on this particular issue.
I mentioned about the freeze to freeze because the military exercise is coming up. So the Trump and the Moon agreed to postpone it until the end of the Paralympics. And Paralympics will start on March 8th, March 10th, and then end on March 18th, I think. So then the military exercise is starting maybe after that. So for now, it's like a peaceful thing, and there's a hope for the more exchange, and we have no idea what's going to happen next month. So this is the time, I think, people have to really raise the question. I don't know, do you know how many military personnel are involved in the key reserve military exercise that is happening in March every single year?
100,000.
Anyone else? 100,000. It's 250,000. 250,000. And about 200 of South Koreans, Japan, even from the Australia, the ships and militaries are coming. And he is really right, because our plan, that's called an our plan 5027 is to decapitate, 5015 is to bomb strategic places like Yeonbyeon, or the known to be the nuclear facilities. 50. So 50 is all about how to kill, how to attack, how to land, So it has a name, and it really has a specific play. It simulates first by computer, and then people carry it out. It's done in that right at the border. It's very close, as you know, South Korea and North Korea. So at the time, I was told that North Koreans do not sleep in their sleepwear during the 1.5 months of the military exercise. They are recommended to sleep in in their clothes so that just in case they have to run to the underground, they can. You know, it's a drill that they, also that maybe, you know, it's a drill that creates a fear inside the people. It's easy, it's hard to have a democracy when there is a fear. But the fear is real, because the incursion happened, the skirmish happens all the time in the West Sea, right? The bombing and shelling happens, exchange of fire happens. So even next week, there are people, the march is coming up, and people are a little bit getting anxious. So in Korea, then there's a national call for street rallies and you know, hearings for postponing further and calling for the freeze to freeze unconditionally, because Trump wants to put the condition saying, you need to give up your nuclear program totally. You know, what was that? Unverifiably, verifiably, something. There is this irreversibly, and you know, all these R words that they used. You know, they have to do that in order to start negotiation. And what's the guarantee that for peace that North Korea can trust before they come up? There's nothing for them to gain by coming up to the peace negotiation if there is nothing that guarantees them for peace and security before they give up the nuclear. So it's going around. They know, US knows about that too. That's why they are putting those conditions. So our demand is without preconditions. People, both sides has to come and do the peace negotiation, and then start from there. We need to build the trust before we start to actually negotiate and talk about the peace, right? So freeze to freeze, but without preconditions, and both sides has to make a real effort to keep their ends of deal.
Yeah, one thing I didn't mention, and maybe it's kind of obvious, but Kim Jong-un paid close attention to what happened in Iraq and Libya, where they either stopped nuclear development, or in the case of Libya, actually got rid of the nuclear weapons, and the dictators were killed. So he's not going to come to the table disarmed, knowing the history of the United States. So the idea that somehow that's a reasonable demand doesn't really hold up to recent history.
I've always been curious how the Korean War started. It went under the UN flag and UN mandate. How did it manage to get that? How did the US manage to get that since it has to go through Security Council? Did the Soviet Union veto, or what did it go through Security Council? How did it get UN mandate?
Bruce Cummings wrote a Origin of Korean War, and that's this thick of file.
Bill, give her the mic.
I'll take the mic.
So Bruce Cummings wrote a two thick volumes of a book that is only about the origin of Korean War. I don't know how to simply say that. It's a good question, because Korean War is the only war that UN Army fought.
Well, I know the answer. I know the
Oh,
answer.
he has the answer.
The answer is the Soviet Union had walked out of the Security Council and was boycotting. So they weren't present for the vote.
Yeah, but then how did the UN were so quickly be able to form the army, and then how this let's not go back, go there.
I feel that one thing that we really need to focus in on was what the United States did to North Korea during the war. In other words, from what I understand, the numbers of dead, the numbers of, there wasn't a building standing, and the numbers of bombs attacked on North Korea is just something that people don't really know the figures about. And then you think about why the North Koreans, have some type of hatred or some type of don't trust the United States. It was an incredible war crime.
Maybe you can just repeat the question before you answer.
Yeah, the question was what U.S. did to North Korea during the Korean War. Yeah, so it was they said the napalm bombing was done, and then a lot of, they said the total amount of the napalm that was used during the World War II, it was twice as much of the bomb was dropped into the Korea, North Korea only. So there was, as he said, there was a no war standing. There was only one building that had standing up in Pyongyang. It was total rubbles after the war. And then there was a lot of massacre of civilians. The people said, even in South Korea, in northern Rhee, you know, people at the time, it was farmers, I said, right? And then also the dye was not very popular, so people wore white clothes. So the white clothes was a symbol of the civilians. But then, which means that if you wear white clothes, then you can pretend to be civilians. So US soldiers had a difficulty in recognizing who's a civilian and who's actually a soldier, pretending to be civilian. And that was the logic behind killing of all the villagers whenever the troops went down. Because then, you know, it's 86% of entire Korean peninsula is mountainous area. It's easy to hide. The guerrilla warfare was very popular at the time also. So total of the 10% of the Koreans were killed in South Korea, but about 25% of the entire population was wiped out in North Korea.